This episode of Reading, Writing, and Ralph is brought to you by the Kathleen and Eddie Arthur Hearts of Love Fund. This fund was founded by Ed Arthur to honor his parents, Eddie and Kathleen, some of the most generous people in Alexandria. This fund stands as a way to ensure they can continue to give back to their community after they are gone. The fund has dispersed almost $100,000 to citizens in need, providing rents as well as other day-to-day expenses. They are now supporting the Domestic Violence Safe House in assisting women and children and providing safety and security to them as they leave their secured house. Please consider this worthy cause by donating through this link. Their safety depends on us.
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Reading, Writing, and Ralph. We have not had one of these episodes in a while. Ralph is back in the country now. We are all shooting from different locations. It is after Memorial Day. I hope everyone had a fabulous weekend with friends and family. So today we are going to be talking to author Ed Moser, who wrote The Lost History of the Capitol. So we're going to, see some really amazing photos from the past and talk about some historical facts that you might not know off the top of your head. I think it's going to be a great episode. So I am going to welcome Ralph, and he can tell us a little bit more about today's author. Good morning, Ralph. How are you?
Good morning, Grace. How about yourself?
I am good. Thank you.
It's good to be back in the country. We were gone for nearly a month in mostly small towns in Tuscany and Umbria, and it was a fabulous journey. And I came across in Florence one of my favorite churches. It's called the Basilica of the Santa Croce, the Holy Cross. And there's a very unique feature about this. At the top of the facade in the front, there's a Star of David, courtesy of the architect and builder of this basilica. And I sent a question out to my friends when I posted it online. The first person to identify what was different about this church, because it's maybe the only Catholic church in the world that has a Star of David. And two of my dear friends prompted in very quickly. Michaela Barnes, who I worked with for a very long time in the business world, and Linda Santamaria, both identified it within seconds. The Star of David at the top of this Catholic church, but quite unique. Talk about unique. Ed is a prolific writer of the history of DC and a lot of stuff that most of us don't even think about or know about. And his latest book, The Lost History of the Capitol, is fascinating. And he's got some great pictures and information in there. And he's written several books. So let's bring Ed on.
Hi, thanks for having me this morning.
Good morning, Ed. Welcome back. How are you?
Just fine.
That's
Welcome
good.
Back from Italy.
Thank you. It's good to be back home. So you were on a year and a half ago, maybe, but refresh the audience on your background, what you've done, your works of the past, because I think you've written several books now, and how you occupy your time today.
Yes, I'm the author of about 12 different books, mostly on history, politics, but also humor and science. Mm-hmm. And lately I've been concentrating on the most historic places in the capital region. I had a book published a year and a half ago, like you mentioned, on the Lafayette Square and President's Park, the White House's unruly neighborhood, crime, scandal, and intrigue in the history of Lafayette Square. And I then came up with a sequel to that last fall, The Lost History of the Capitol, the wild and hidden history of Congress and the Capitol building. That's the book I'll be talking about today. I've worked in the past. I've been a comedy writer and also worked in politics with presidential speech writing. And I found that working for the Tonight Show and for the presidency was very similar in that you make sausage. You draw topics from across the board and combine them together into hopefully something that'll be satisfying for public consumption.
So which is more comedic, writing for the president or writing for the comedians?
It could be about the same. depending on the different eras.
Yeah. So, what inspired you to start writing about some of the hidden histories within the DC metro area?
Well, I take an unusual approach, sort of a bottoms up approach to history. I love travel like you do, Ralph, and I'll be walking through an historic locale, and something will strike my eye, like an ancient building, maybe a historical plaque. And on the Capitol grounds, for instance, there's a number of historical trees. There's an Anne Frank tree. There's a tree that's a tribute to the September 11th heroes who tried to actually fight back against a hijacked plane. There's a tree about a tragic family in the Second World War that lost a number of their brothers. And that'll strike my fancy, and I'll start doing research on those incidents. And they might turn into a story, might turn into a chapter. And before I know it, I have a bunch of chapters that I can turn into a book on that historic locale, be it the Capitol building grounds or Lafayette Square, or my hopefully forthcoming book on historic Old Town Alexandria.
Oh, wow. Wow. Well, when you get that book completed, we'll have you back on again, because Alexandria does have a fascinating history, particularly if you believe in ghosts.
Yes, there are a lot. Sometimes I'll lead a ghost tour of Alexandria, especially on Halloween.
What's your favorite ghost place in Alexandria?
It would have to be the wax effigy in the old cotton mill on Washington Street. There was an Irish guard at the old cotton mill. It's so antebellum, so Old South. Right down the street from Robert E. Lee's boyhood home is the old cotton mill. Talk about the Old South in microcosm. And a watchman was murdered in the 1840s. And to try to capture the killer, the police fashioned a wax effigy of the guard, which they placed in the cupola of the cotton mill to try to lure the murderer back, making him think that he hadn't bumped the watchman off. The effort failed, but the wax effigy remains there today, much distorted by heat and cold over the decades. And supposedly the ghost of the watchman is up in the cupola. So that's my favorite, I think.
Wow, that's pretty good. Let's get back to the Capitol for a second. One of the subtitles to the book is "The Hidden and Tumultuous Saga of Congress in the Capitol Building," and a lot of what you point out in your book have been hidden for years from the public. A lot of the stuff. Do you think some of those things, if they occurred today, would have remained hidden, or has life changed so much that nothing is hidden anymore?
Well, I think it's the passage of time. I think the events that I chronicle in the book were known at the time and were struck people as incredible or disturbing at the time, but people have just forgotten it. Americans tend to have a short-term memory about their own history, and one of the reasons for the book is to try to unearth these amazing episodes from the past. For instance, the Capitol was troubled from the very start. When it was being constructed, in fact, the designer of Washington, D.C., of course, is the French engineer Pierre Lafont. And his design for a cosmopolitan city eventually took root, but he had a lot of trouble at the start. When his workmen were constructing a road just to the south of the future Capitol building, his men came upon a beautiful townhouse in constructing New Jersey Avenue. And instead of asking the owner of the house for permission to build the road around it, perhaps, they tore the house down. They took it apart stone by stone. It turned out that the house belonged to the Carroll family, as in Carroll County, Maryland, the most prominent family in Maryland, which had given the land to the federal government to build the Capitol building, Capitol Hill. President George Washington was extremely upset about upsetting the Carroll family, that it would put his whole federal initiative of a new capital city into jeopardy. And we actually have a series of letters back and forth between the Carrolls and President Washington. It led to the dismissal of the designer of Washington, D.C., Pierre Lafont. He was fired in part because of this incident. So the Capitol building area has been troubled from the start.
Wow.
As
So
well
that
as
was
having many as well as having many accomplishments and great achievements, I should add it for balance.
Oh, good. So, it's, some of the stories are hilarious like that, because who knew L'Enfant fell from favor, and the reason why? I certainly didn't. But anyway, let me get back to one of the regular features. Tonight we will have 2 trivia questions. First person in with the correct answer will win an autographed copy of Ed's new book. First question: what is on top of the Capitol? So we know there's a figure up there. So what is on top of the Capitol? And we'll announce the winners on online tomorrow after we review the tape. So anyway, that's the first question of the night. So there was another troubling, to me, chapter in this book, and it was called "The Nazis' Plot to Blow Up America." And maybe it was brought up way back when, but I don't ever remember reading about that till your book. Why don't you describe that a little bit? Because that one seemed dark and sinister enough where it could have actually happened.
Yes, that's it was called Operation Pastorius. It was and it involved a number of locales in the D.C. area, including the Supreme Court right across from the Capitol building. Hitler wanted to destroy or damage the arsenal of democracy, the munitions plants, the industrial infrastructure of America in the Second World War. So he sent 2 U-boats with 8 saboteurs, landed off of Long Island in Florida, with the intent of blowing up dams, factories, even Macy's department store in New York, because it was Jewish owned, in Nazi philosophy. And due to the good work of the Coast Guard and the FBI, and 2 whistleblowers among the 8 Nazis, 2 of whom were anti-Nazi, the 8 men were quickly rounded up. And President Franklin Roosevelt had a decision to make about whether to try them in civilian courts or military courts, a military tribunal. It very much pertains to today, recent years with Guantanamo Bay, and whether to try terrorist suspects in civilian courts or in our military base in Cuba. Franklin Roosevelt, for security reasons, had them tried military tribunal just a few blocks from the Capitol building at the Justice Department building. And they were all sentenced to death. The president then found out that 2 of the 8 men were whistleblowers, and he commuted their sentences to long prison terms. The other 6 were sentenced to death, and the Supreme Court, right across from the Capitol, in extraordinary summer session, convened to review the case and reaffirmed the sentences. The stage then went to the old Capitol Prison, which is still the new Washington City Jail near RFK Stadium, and where the 6 men were to be executed, one after the other, which filled the authorities at the prison with concern. The means of execution at the time was electrocution, and they feared that if 6 men were electrocuted one after the other, that would blow out all the circuits of the jail. So they turned off all the power in the jail except for the execution room, known as Old Sparky, where the electric chair was. And the 6 men were within 60 minutes, all 6 were put to death. It didn't work out too well. The expressions on their faces, on the corpses, they're frozen in horror. The question then became what to do with the bodies. And President Roosevelt was afraid if they were buried in a public cemetery, they might become a shrine for Nazis or neo-Nazis. So they were taken across the Potomac River from Alexandria, Virginia, and buried in paupers' graves in undisclosed locations, if you will. And the president's fears actually came about because maybe 15 years later, Pepco workers, utility workers, came across the graves, and they found that Nazi flags were placed on the shrines by Aryan, by skinhead types. It's my understanding that the government has pretty much erased the location of those graves, so that couldn't reoccur. And
Wow.
So it's sort of a mysterious grave on the bluffs above Old Town Alexandria. So that's the story of the Nazi saboteurs and what became of them.
Wow, interesting. The what are some other things that most people wouldn't know about the Capitol or its history that you reveal in the book?
Well, the among other things, the Capitol is a work of across many generations and has several iterations. The original Capitol was much smaller than today. It was designed by the father of American architecture, Benjamin Latrobe, with help from another fine architect, William Thornton, and it was much smaller. And then, of course, it was destroyed in perhaps the worst day in Washington, D.C. history. There are many contenders for that throne, but August 24th, 1814, 2 years after that war that started in 1812, the British Army marched into D.C., and along with burning down the White House, they burned down the Capitol building. So Benjamin Latrobe had to reconstruct the thing, which he did with great skill. He then turned it off to a Massachusetts architect, it regained its dome. But it wasn't until the Civil War, really, when another great architect came along, a Union general named Montgomery Meigs, and he supervised the construction of the Great Rotunda, the great dome that we know today. So it's really, there's several iterations of the Capitol building, just not the one that we know today.
Wow, interesting history. Interesting. At this point, I'd like to get to our second trivia question, so give folks out there a chance to. Most of them will get on their phones if they don't know the answer. Name any one of the three buildings in D.C. that are taller than the Capitol. So there are three buildings in D.C. that are taller than the Capitol. Name any one of them. First one in with the correct answer will win a copy of The Lost History of the Capitol by Ed Moser. Ed, talk about your favorite parts of the book, and I think you've got some pictures to help the audience visualize each one of those. So
some of my favorite portions are the so-called breaches of the Capitol. Of course, in January 2021, you had a breach of the Capitol. You also had bombings of the Capitol, the Senate, in the 1970s, the 1980s, and even in the 1910s. It's sort of forgotten history. Here's a picture of the bombing of the old telegraph office on the Senate side in 1915, 1916. It was by a crazy professor, Professor Erich Munter, who was a sympathizer for Germany during the First World War. And he thought that by blowing up the telegraph office of the Senate, he would send a message to America to stay out of World War I. After the bombing, he then went to New York City, where he planted a incendiary bomb on a munitions ship, which caught fire in the Atlantic a few days later. And he then went to the house of J.P. Morgan Jr., a financier of France and Britain during the war, and he shot J.P. Morgan Jr., badly wounding him before being captured and sent to prison, where he committed suicide. Apparently, it was a wild story in several cities, and one of the bombings of the Capitol building, one of the three bombings that have occurred. I think my favorite period, because so much crazy stuff happened, was the 1830s. It was just a wild period. It involved the caning of a congressman by a former senator. It involved the only death of a congressman by another congressman after altercation in the Capitol building. Two congressmen, Congressman Silly, his actual name was Silly from New England, and a Congressman Graves, his actual name was Graves from Virginia. They decided to have a duel, a la Hamilton and Burr.
yeah.
But instead of dueling pistols, they had a duel with rifles.
Oh, gee.
From a distance of 100 yards. Dueling was illegal in the District of Columbia, but it was legal in Prince George's County in Bladensburg, Maryland, which had dueling grounds. And the two congressmen went out there and they fought it out with rifles from 100 paces. And sadly, on the third shot, 3 times is a charm or 3 times is a harm. On the third shot, Congressman Silly was shot in the upper thigh and he bled to death. The only congressman to be killed by another congressman in American history. The good news was that Congress then outlawed dueling anywhere in Maryland or in the district, anywhere. You couldn't fight another congressman.
It's a good thing.
The 1830s was all in 1835. You had the first attempted presidential assassination. President Andrew Jackson was leaving a funeral in the House of Representatives, and on the Capitol steps, he was assaulted by a crazy man, David Lawrence, who pulled 2 pistols on Old Hickory, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. There's a rather comical, amateurishly portrayed depiction of Old Hickory taking his hickory cane and going after his would-be assassin after the assassin's gun misfired, not once, but twice. And he nearly beat the assassin to death, according to some accounts, the would-be assassin, until a congressman from his home state of Tennessee pulled the president off the would-be killer. And that congressman happened to be Davy Crockett, the famous frontiersman who was then serving in Congress. It turned out that David Lawrence, although Jackson suspected political intrigue, that Lawrence was a political enemy of his, it turned out that Lawrence was a house painter. And back in the 1830s, paint was filled with lead and mercury, and those toxic compounds probably drove Mr. Lawrence to insanity.
Wow. That's the good old Davy Crockett. He seems to pop up more places than imaginable. But give us another one.
Well, also I believe in 1835, also, there was a spat between a former senator from Tennessee, not Jackson, not Davy Crockett, and a congressman from Ohio named Stansbury, who slandered the former senator from Tennessee, who took great umbrage. And back in the day, if you had your good name sullied, you would challenge the other fellow to a duel. Seems like the Ohio congressman was something of a coward and he refused the duel. So the slandered Tennessean, well, he felt his name had been besmirched. He was accused of corruption, probably unfairly. And plus he saw his opponent as a coward. So he got his own hickory cane, actually from Andrew Jackson's estate, Hermitage Estate in Tennessee. And he would carry it around the Capitol grounds looking for his slanderer. And one day, on the way to the theater, one of the first theaters constructed in D.C. next to the Capitol, this man came upon Congressman Stanberry and began to administer him a beating, a terrible beating with his hickory cane, nearly killed him. He was brought before Congress, but he had friends in high places. Wow. One of his friends was President Jackson. One of his other friends was the Speaker of the House, a future president, James K. Polk of Tennessee. And the fellow got off without prison time, and he got off with just a slap on the wrist, a fine, which the President Jackson, refused to collect. But his political career was in jeopardy, and he had to leave. He had to leave the capital city, and he moved south by southwest and wound up in a place called Texas. And he wound up as the president of the Lone Star State, the Republic of Texas, for the former senator from Tennessee was none other than Sam Houston.
Oh, wow. Sam
Houston, who administered one of the worst beatings. There's a picture of him. He administered one of the worst beatings of one congressman to another in the history of the Capitol building. So that's maybe my favorite era, although there's most of the events are kind of bloody and disturbing to us in the modern times.
I tell you, some things change and some things never change. What do you think was the most troubling era for the Congress, both the House and the Senate and the Capitol?
Well, I talked about the 1830s, but the 1860s, of course, was maybe the most troubling and heroic era in American history. I'm talking about the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And of course, much of the Congress left the Congress in 1861. Jefferson Davis from Mississippi gave a famous farewell speech, and all the Southerners except Andrew Johnson from Tennessee, they left the Congress to their respective states, and the war ensued. And one of the most remarkable locales in that era was the old Capitol Prison, which is the site of today's Supreme Court. Back then, it was a hotel where the Congress had met in the War of 1812, after the British burned down the Capitol. Congress had to meet somewhere, so they met at this hotel across from the Capitol building until the Capitol building was rebuilt. When the Civil War came, that old hotel was turned into a prison for Confederate spies and prisoners of war. And one of the most disturbing, well, there's actually two incidents that come to mind, both towards the end of the war. One was on perhaps the worst day in Washington history, after the burning of the city itself in the War of 1812. On April 14th and 15th, 1865, a certain incident occurred at Ford's Theater in downtown DC, half a dozen blocks from the Capitol. President Lincoln was assassinated. People were enraged in the capital city. The war was almost over, celebration was in the air, and then the president is taken from them, the apostle of union and abolition. In fact, some returning Confederate soldiers coming back into the town on that night were attacked by lynch mobs and beaten up badly. But a huge mob formed outside the Capitol prison with calls for burning the place down and killing the hundreds of prisoners within the prison walls. But the architect of the Capitol at the time, Montgomery Meigs, this is the day after Memorial Day, and we should remember that General Montgomery Meigs of the Union Army, he founded Arlington National Cemetery during the war on grounds confiscated from Robert E. Lee's estate at the Arlington House. Montgomery Meigs was the hero of the hour. He was no killer, and he organized Union troops to defend the Confederate prisoners inside the Capitol prison, saving them from slaughter. And then some weeks later, a horrible event occurred outside the Capitol prison with the only war criminal put to death because of the Civil War, a Dr. Henry Worse, who had been the commandant of the infamous Andersonville prison in Georgia, where thousands of Union troops, Union prisoners of war, died from bad nutrition, lack of medical care, and mistreatment. Henry Worse was something of a fall guy. He was imprisoned at the Capitol prison, and he was hanged on the grounds there, right in the view of the Capitol building itself. And it was a botched hanging. His neck didn't snap, and he dangled for many minutes before suffocating to death. And there's actually photographs, perhaps from the Matthew Brady studio. There's photographs of the Union troops up on the trees watching the hanging, looking on in horror at this terrible execution. So it was a kind of a gruesome place during the Civil War, but also a place of great glory because the Union was preserved and slavery was finally ended. Wow.
Interesting. Your book is full of stories like this. Let's have one more for the audience. This way we don't want to give away too much, and we want to get them out there buying the book and reading it. One thing that caught my attention, and I think most of us remember the film Saving Private Ryan, Tom Hanks going after the sole remaining son of the Ryan family. In your book, there's a segment, the real Saving Private Ryan. Tell the audience about that.
Yes, most people who walk from the Supreme Court building to the Capitol or back, they go across a space of lawn, and without noticing, they go by 5 trees and 5 crabapple trees. And if they look very closely at the ground, they might see a historical plaque. And it tells the amazing story of 5 brothers who served on board a U.S. Navy ship in the South Pacific during the Second World War. 1942, epic battle of Guadalcanal, U.S. Marines, U.S. Navy. Again, we just had Memorial Day. And tragically, all 5 brothers were on the same ship, which was torpedoed by an Imperial Japanese submarine, and all 5 perished. All 5 brothers from the same family. There's a scene in Saving Private Ryan where Mrs. Ryan is on the porch of her farmhouse in the middle of the Midwest, in the middle of nowhere, and she sees a U.S. Army Jeep approaching her from the distance. She realizes only one reason the Army is going to pay any attention to a lady like her. And she realizes that one or more of her sons have died. And she's informed in the movie that all but one have died. And of course, in the movie, the Tom Hanks character saves the surviving brother. But that movie is really a spinoff of the actual event of the Sullivan brothers, the 5 Sullivan brothers who served in the U.S. Navy on board the same ship in the Pacific. Probably 2 of them survived the sinking, but then died in the aftermath. One of them was probably eaten by sharks after falling off his boat. Another probably died of dehydration in the waters of the South Pacific. So poor Mrs. Sullivan and her husband were met by officials from the Navy and a chaplain. And when they entered their house, Mr. Sullivan said, "Okay, which one is it? Which one of my sons have I lost?" And he and his wife were informed, all 5. The worst news that any mother could have gotten, perhaps the worst news that any American mother got in any of our wars. Congress and the Navy remembered her great sacrifice of Mrs. Sullivan, her sons, and in the years after the Second World War, they took her to that spot on the lawn of the Capitol building. And they planted, in her presence, 5 crabapple trees, one for each of her sons. And as you might know, crab apples have a very sour taste, and they have a red color. And the red color imitates the blood of their sacrifice, and the sour taste shows the terrible feeling that Mrs. Sullivan must have had on learning the news of her son's demise. So it's one of the most poignant spots on the Capitol building grounds.
Wow. Very touching story. It's a terrific read. It's chock full of information, facts, some fun, some disturbing, some we just don't know about until you read them. Anyway, what's next, Ed? I know you've got another book, The History of Alexandria, due out. What else? I know you're doing tours. What else?
I give tours of the Capitol grounds and other historic locales in the area through Lafayette Square Tours of Scandal. My goal is to try to write a book on each of the 4 most historic locales in the Capitol region. I've done the White House and the Capitol building, and I want to do Georgetown, perhaps with a particular focus on espionage, a history of spies in Georgetown. But currently, I've finished a draft for I tried to do a little bit of a different twist. Instead of a nonfiction history book, I'm writing a novel, a murder mystery set in contemporary Old Town Alexandria, but based on terrible events in the past, murders and robberies in the past that seem to be reenacted in contemporary Alexandria, Virginia. So that's hopefully I'll get that out to the publishers in the next couple of months.
Wow, boy, you keep busy. Well, good. As always, it's been a pleasure having you on. When the History of Alexandria is done, drop me a note. We'll get you back and get talking about that book. It's good seeing you again, and stay well.
Welcome back, Ralph. I'll let you know about the next work.
Great, will do. Thanks, Ed.
Take care.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
All right, great interview. Fascinating. I live in downtown DC, so to hear some of these facts that I did not know off the top of my head is fascinating, and now I want to go back to the Hill and explore more of what I've learned. So Ralph, you are back. When is your next show? Are we're back to normal schedule?
Yes, we're back to normal schedule, and I think we're pretty much booked out into September.
All right. So your next show, 2 weeks from now, correct?
2 weeks from today, I have Seal Warren on with her latest book, When Only Happily Ever After Will Do. It's the conclusion of her a trilogy on life in a small hamlet in New York State. So it's interesting, and she's got some twists in there.
Yeah, wonderful. So I'm excited to be back on the regular schedule with you. I'm excited to see you again 2 weeks from now. So until then, everyone, be the good news in someone's life.